The Asian Art Museum of San Francisco contains one of the great collections of Chinese art outside of China. This art was produced over a span of 6,000 years and served many different functions. Hello, my name is Brian Hogarth, and I'm Director of Education at the museum. In this program, we're going to tour the Chinese galleries and look at a variety of objects in different media. These objects reflect not only aesthetic values, but also technical achievements and cultural beliefs. We'll start with objects from ancient burial sites and tombs. These objects cover thousands of years, from the Neolithic period through the Bronze Age and continuing in the Han and Tang dynasties. Let's begin with this small bottle from the Neolithic period. It's about 6,000 years old. Neolithic means New Stone Age. At this time, China as a nation did not exist. People lived in small groups, moving from a hunting and gathering life to a more settled life in small villages. They'd begun to domesticate animals and raise crops, so they needed pots in which to store foodstuffs. And very special pots like this one were painted and buried with the dead. This is early evidence of a belief in an afterlife. The people who made these earthenware vessels are known as the painted pottery cultures. They lived in the north-central plains of China. These pots were handmade by coiling and then smoothing the clay. Control of the elements, earth, air, fire, and water, was the first step in transforming raw materials into something both useful and beautiful. In the Neolithic period, one material began to be revered above the rest: jade. There are two types of jade, jadeite and nephrite. Jadeite, seen in this beautiful vase with handle, has a high gloss and has only been used since the 18th century. Nephrite has a waxy surface and comes in a variety of colors. Nephrite was the material of choice for most of China's history. Here we see a variety of nephrite jades associated with burials. This round disc with a hole in the middle and this round tube with square corners were produced by the Liangzhu cultures in the east coast of China about 4,000 years ago. We don't know what these objects originally meant, but we do know that they were placed in graves, sometimes in great numbers, over the bodies of certain individuals. Centuries later, Chinese texts refer to the disc as a bee symbolizing the heavens, and the tube as a zang symbolizing the earth. Jade is very hard. It cannot be cut, but must be abraded or worn into a shape. It seems that certain people had the means or power to have these stones laboriously worked into these forms, something that took months, if not years, to produce in such quantities. The power and prestige associated with jade set the stage for another important material: bronze. Like jade, bronze required an immense amount of labor to produce. Bronze is an alloy of copper, tin, and sometimes lead. In ancient times, it had to be mined and cast using ceramic piece molds. Here was another technological breakthrough. Here we can see how a small bronze vessel would have been cast. First, you make a ceramic model of the vessel with all the designs on it. Using fresh clay, you make an impression of the designs on pieces called molds. The original model is then scaled down to form a core, leaving a tiny space around it for the molten bronze to be poured in here. You can also see that space here. After cooling, the mold pieces are broken off, leaving the finished bronze here, which over time develops a greenish-gray patina. We know about this process because we find remnants of the ceramic piece molds at ancient foundry sites. Unlike jade, bronze had a practical application. It could be used to make weapons, and these weapons could both extend and defend the community. The Bronze Age coincides with the rise of the first great states in China, the Shang and the Zhou dynasties. Dynasties were ruling families with a common lineage or group of ancestors. These ancestors were worshipped because it was believed they could act on behalf of the living to influence the affairs of state. This meant that they had to be cared for. And what better way to care for your ancestors than to offer them plenty of food and wine? Bronze was used to cast ritual vessels that were used in banquets honoring the ancestors. This large bronze ritual vessel was used to heat wine in just such a banquet. The tripod shape allows the wine, made from millet, to be heated underneath. It comes from a tomb of the late Shang dynasty, around the 1200s before the Common Era. Objects like this were buried with Shang royalty in huge pit tombs, along with members of their family and human sacrifices. The vessel is covered with intricate designs. Notice the monster mask design on the surface of many Shang vessels. This is sometimes called taotie. We don't know what the design meant, but it's not hard to imagine how impressive these vessels were when they were bright and shiny and new, placed high on an altar table, the steam from the food and the wine rising up to attract the spirits of the ancestors. Around 1050 or 1045 before the Common Era, the Zhou conquered the Shang. The Zhou had been vassals of the Shang, so their right to rule was based not on lineage, but on what they called the mandate of heaven, a new moral imperative. Ancestors remained important, but changes in ritual practice gradually took place. How do we know all this? The earliest writing from ancient China survives on oracle bones, used for divination or fortune-telling. By the Zhou period, we see longer inscriptions on the bronzes, giving us more information. Here is one of those inscriptions on a food vessel. We can read about the Duke of Zhou, who was later admired by Confucius as an exemplary ruler. This large wine vessel, or hu, also has a long inscription inside telling us it was cast by a father for his daughter's wedding. Here we have an ancient bell, suspended and played by tapping on the lower rim. It's inscribed with a wish that the owner's father and future generations enjoy its sound. Bronzes were now being cast to commemorate the living as well as the dead. Designs were changing as well. Gone were the fierce taotie masks, replaced by abstract wave shapes, by inlay, and by complicated interlocking patterns. As the Zhou dynasty progressed, power shifted to a number of competing states, and more aristocrats and local rulers sought the trappings and ceremonial regalia of the royal court. Sacrificial victims began to be replaced by models, usually made of clay. The most famous example of this is the vast terracotta army of the first emperor who died in 210 before the Common Era. This practice extended into the succeeding dynasty, the Han, a period of relative stability and expansion that corresponds roughly to the time of the Roman Empire in the West. As the economy expanded, the demand for tomb objects increased. Beliefs in the immortality of the soul became more elaborate. This ceramic vessel corresponds to the shape of a bronze vessel and is decorated with images of heavenly clouds. These lead-glazed burial objects give us a vivid picture of all aspects of daily life during the Han Dynasty. Here we have model gate pillars, capped with roof tiles, decorated with phoenix birds and door guardians. One of the most unusual burial objects on display is this money tree dating from the Eastern or later Han Dynasty, about the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era. It consists of a ceramic base topped by a series of branches cast in bronze on which hang replicas of Han Dynasty coins. On the base we see animals and hunting scenes. The branches are filled with creatures covered in feathers. These are the immortals. Overseeing this heavenly realm is a popular figure of the times known as Shi Wang Mu, the Queen Mother of the West. The whole tree is a progression from earth to heaven, an image of abundance and wealth. There's a small figure who appears on the stem partway up the tree. This is probably an image of the Buddha, but he's not yet an independent image of worship in China, but still part of Shi Wangmu's kingdom. The next major dynasty was the Tang. With its capital at present-day Xi'an, the Tang was a cosmopolitan dynasty when all things foreign were in vogue. Horses and camels, traders and musicians, those who plied the Silk Road across Asia, were all depicted in the arts. These tomb objects, made around the 8th century, were decorated with a 3-color glaze called sansai that was allowed to drip over the object, making the pieces appear very lively. Here we see what appears to be a man, but it's actually a woman of the court, dressed in the robes of a foreigner and holding a tropical bird, as if to present a tribute gift. In the next part of our tour, we'll look at Buddhist arts. These are sculptures dating from just after the Han Dynasty through the Tang and Sung dynasties, a period of about 1,000 years. Throughout Chinese history, there were a number of foreign incursions. Perhaps one of the greatest outside influences was that of Buddhism. Buddhism began in India with the life of Siddhartha Gautama about the 6th or 5th century before the Common Era. At the same time Confucius was teaching in China about social values, Prince Siddhartha left his life in the palace to search for enlightenment and to find release from the cycle of rebirth and suffering which he saw around him. Buddhism came to China centuries later with traders and merchants along the sea routes and overland along the Silk Road. After the Han Dynasty, China fell into a period of chaos and division. Buddhism offered a message of salvation, and it didn't discriminate between men and women, rich and poor, educated and uneducated. This is one of our most important pieces in the Chinese collection because it's the earliest known dated Buddha from China. The date, written on the back, is equivalent to our date of 338 of the Common Era. We know it's the Buddha because of the special signs that appear on him, such as the cranial bump, the meditative pose, and the monk's robe. This piece was probably modeled after a northern Indian image that made its way to China along the Silk Road. Several hundred years later, northern China was ruled by the foreign Wei dynasty. They adopted Buddhism, a foreign religion, as a way to legitimize their rule. In this stone stele, we see a central Buddha figure accompanied by two bodhisattvas, surrounded by a mandorla, or flame-like halo. Bodhisattvas are enlightened beings who've chosen to forego Buddhahood in order to help humanity.
The main figures are dressed in Chinese court robes and sculpted in a more elongated style, with great attention paid to the pleats of the robes and a slight smile on the faces. The carving is shallow, with the emphasis on flowing lines, like calligraphy. How did the majority of Chinese take to Buddhism? Here was a problem.
Buddhism was a monastic religion, and for monks and nuns, that meant a rejection of family life, very different from Confucian values. For the layperson, however, Buddhism encouraged donations as a way to build merit, but also as a way to honor one's family. So in this case, an entire family has pooled their resources to commission this stele for placement in a temple.
Individual Buddhist figures also adapted more Chinese characteristics. One was the bodhisattva figure known as Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, one who hears the pleas of humanity. In China, this figure became known as Guanyin. Now, bodhisattvas are more lavishly dressed than the Buddha, indicating their presence in the world. And this Tang dynasty bronze figure of Guanyin has a gentle sway to the hips and long flowing robes, much more sensuous than the stiff Northern Way figures we just saw. Over time, beliefs and stories surrounding Guanyin increased. Guanyin could appear male or female depending on the circumstances. This is a large wooden version known as a water and moon Guanyin, dating from the Song dynasty, about the 12th century. Originally brightly painted, it would have stood in a temple, its gentle face peering down on the worshipper. In the next section, we'll look at Chinese ceramics, particularly the high-fired ceramics made in the later imperial dynasties, from about 1000 CE to the 1700s. We've already seen how the Chinese potter made a variety of grave goods out of low-fired ceramics. But it was the high-fired ceramics that became famous all over the world. The first attempts to make high-fired ceramics began in the Shang dynasty. But between the Tang and the Song dynasties, that is from about the 900s to the 1200s, the Chinese began to perfect many of the techniques in ceramics that would make the word China synonymous with fine dinnerware.
The Chinese potter had to move beyond earthenware, which is not very strong and cannot hold liquids. The technical answer to these problems lay in the choice of clays, firing temperatures, the atmosphere of the kiln, and in manipulating colors and glazes.
The ultimate goal was the high-fired wares we call porcelain. A key ingredient was kaolin clay, seen in this Xingware from the late Tang dynasty.
Porcelain is fired at the highest temperature, and this is what gives it its strength. You can see here that the glaze and the clay body are totally fused.
During the northern Song dynasty, the imperial court began to patronize ceramic production. Kilns began to specialize in different kinds of wares. Ceramics became elegant and refined. These junwares are noted for their brilliant splashes of crimson or purple glaze. Longchuan wares had a smooth, thick glaze that resembled jade.
It was about this time that a series of foreign rulers took over China, first in 1127 when the Sung court fled south, and again about a century later when the Mongols took over the whole of China. During troubled times, people tend to look to the past for comfort and inspiration. In Chinese art, this is called archaism.
In this guanware, layers and layers of glaze have been added. Crackling of the glaze has been emphasized. The form of the vessel is based on the ancient jade song that we saw earlier, a clear reference to the past. These dingwares were the first mass-produced porcelains. They were stacked in containers inside the kiln to keep the flames and the ash off the surface of the vessels. Dingwares were decorated by being pressed over a mold, but in this Yaozhou vessel, molding has been combined with incising so that the glaze pools in certain places. Suzhou wares, by contrast, were decorated with lively motifs, sometimes painted, or sometimes by adding a slip and then incising the surface to create contrasting colors. In the south, potters working at Jingdezhen began to combine two ingredients that gave them the beauty, strength, and forms they were looking for. These ingredients were kaolin clay and a crushed porcelain stone called patunzi. Qingbai wares were among these new porcelains, with a light bluish tinge.
It was the introduction of cobalt blue, mainly imported from the Middle East, that allowed potters to decorate their wares with elaborate designs in a color that could withstand the high firing temperatures of porcelain.
These were the famous blue and white wares that came to perfection during the Mongol period and the Ming dynasty that followed. Blue and white porcelains could be adapted to the needs of a variety of customers. They were highly sought after across Asia and eventually in Europe. In China, they were used at court, in Buddhist temples, and given as gifts.
One last great innovation remained: how to apply other colors on porcelain with the same painterly effects. These techniques were perfected during the Qing, the last of the imperial dynasties before the 20th century.
Previously, colors had been obtained from copper, iron, and cobalt. A whole new range of colors now came from enamels, but enamels could not withstand the high firing temperature of porcelain. So the Chinese fired the porcelain body first at high temperatures, then added the enamels on top of the glaze and fired it again at lower temperatures.
If you look closely, you can see how the enamels sit on the surface of the glaze here, in contrast to the blue and white, where the decoration is under the glaze.
In some cases, individual colors were prescribed for certain members of the court, and potters worked hard to achieve perfection of colors that even today are difficult to match in quality. In other examples, we see narrative scenes, men riding on their horses to visit friends, an official departing from a rendezvous with his lover, and a lady reading indoors, seated in front of a large painted screen.
These leisurely pursuits, reading, writing, painting, and calligraphy, visiting friends, admiring antiquities, playing music, were all associated with the traditional group known as the literati. These were the educated elite, the scholars who had passed the rigorous exams based on the Confucian classics.
The last section concerns painting and decorative arts of the scholar class. Our examples will be drawn mainly from the Ming and Qing dynasties over the last few centuries. Scholars filled the ranks of the government bureaucracy, but occasionally they retreated from official life and took up artistic pursuits such as painting, calligraphy, and poetry. These three perfections are at the heart of Chinese painting. Traditional Chinese painting is all about brushwork, the manipulation of line, and the various strokes that express one's inner being. Poetry is often part of the painting, and calligraphy is considered to be the highest form of artistic expression. The landscape paintings of the literati were meant to express a feeling or sentiment, often referring to an earlier landscape master or tradition. Chinese painters were not as concerned as Western painters to show a specific place or the illusion of space from a single perspective.
This is a hanging scroll painting called Striving for the Summit by contemporary Hong Kong artist Harold Wong. It's a monumental landscape with waterfalls, mountains, and swirling clouds.
Humans are tiny in relation to the natural world. Wong admires Chinese painting because it allows for individual expression while drawing on an ancient tradition. Wong began by copying the works of earlier artists to learn from and pay respects to that tradition. This harkens back to that respect for ancestors that we saw expressed in the ancient bronzes.
We're back in the jade gallery, only this time we're looking at a relatively modern jade from about a century ago that's a copy of an ancient bronze vessel, the same tripod shape that we saw earlier in the program.
The scholars placed antiques in their studies as a sign of respect for the past and as an indication of their taste and refinement. By referencing the past, Chinese art objects became layered with meaning. For example, this jade water container from the Ming dynasty was made for use with brush painting. It's in the shape of a fruit called a Buddha hand citron because it resembles the hands of a Buddha. The pronunciation of the term for Buddha's hand, fu shou, sounds like the words for blessings and longevity. Many of the jades we see here probably were given as gifts between friends, gifts that convey good wishes for blessings, fortune, and longevity.
We've seen a range of objects made of ceramics, jade, bronze, carved stone, brush, and ink. These objects are imbued with cultural, aesthetic, and technical qualities that attest to the variety and brilliance of Chinese culture over many millennia. Thanks for joining me for this brief tour of the Chinese galleries at the Asian Art Museum.